Welcome back, parents. Today, we're tackling the issue of why gender matters and the confusion our kids are experiencing when they witness their neighbor friends or their peers identifying as the opposite sex. And, in my opinion, there's no one more qualified to talk about this than our number one fan favorite and expert, Dr. Leonard Sax. So welcome back to the show, Dr. Sax.
Thanks for inviting me.
Dr. Sax, I've been a fan of yours for years, and I personally understand your education and experience in this space. But can you just share with our audience a little bit about your education and professional experience that truly makes you an expert in this field?
Well, sure. So I attended public schools in Ohio, K through 12. I earned my undergraduate degree in biology at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I earned my doctorate in psychology, as my PhD in psychology, as well as my MD, my medical degree at the University of Pennsylvania. I did a 3-year residency in family medicine at Lancaster General Hospital in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And I have been a medical doctor now for 38 years. In the United States, I have been board certified in family medicine for 35 years. So I am a family doctor, but I started visiting schools in the United States in 2001. I have now visited more than 500 schools over the last 23 years. I posted a link. You can look at all my school visits from 2005 to the present. When I started visiting schools, I really had a passion for public schools because, as you know, I'm a graduate of public schools, K through 12. And I started leading workshops for public schools. If you look at the early years, 2005 and 6 and 7 and 8, it was almost all public schools. But I'm no longer welcome at public schools. If you look at recent years, it's all Catholic schools and private schools and Protestant schools. I can tell you some stories about that, about how I've recently been counseled to public schools, if that interests you. But I'm no longer welcome. A few public charter schools like the Hillsdale schools will still have me, but I haven't spoken at a regular public school in years.
Well, you have certainly been all over the globe speaking,
Mm-hmm.
but lots of schools in the United States as well. And I do want to know a little bit about why public schools canceled you, because your
Okay.
new book that just came out this month, The Collapse of Parenting, the fully revised and
Yes.
updated version, has this chapter, and it just, oh my goodness, it's
Okay.
titled Babies. And
Yeah.
so tell us about it.
That actually ties into our topic today, the transgender issue. So back in 2019, I had the privilege of speaking at Helen Keller Middle School in Easton, Connecticut. And early last year, 2023, the superintendent reached out and said, Dr. Sax, we've been keeping records on our professional development for many years. And when you spoke here in 2019, we got great reviews from our teachers. You got some of the highest marks from our teachers for your professional development. We'd like to bring you back to do another workshop with our teachers and to lead a session for our parents. And we'd like you to do your talk for parents titled TikTok ate my daughter, and my son won't stop playing video games. What parents need to know about social media and video games. And I said, great. So we wrote a contract, and it was all set up for me to speak at Helen Keller Middle School in Easton, Connecticut. And they prepared a flyer and sent out an email to start promoting the presentation for parents. And a parent who had a transgender child, a child born a daughter, but who had announced that this child, it was now a boy, a trans boy. The parent reached out to the superintendent and said, well, I Googled this Leonard Sax, and I saw an interview he did on Megyn Kelly where he said that these girls who say they're boys are in most cases confused and mistaken and should not transition to the male role, and I don't want him to speak. And the superintendent said, all right, you're welcome to come to the board meeting and present your petition. So she came to the meeting of the school board and presented her position, and the board voted, and by a vote of 9-0, rejected her position.
Okay.
Whereupon she reached out to the national organization and an activist for the national transgender contacted the superintendent and said, if you bring Dr. Sax to Easton, Connecticut, you better hire a lot of security because we will be there in force. We will have bullhorns. We will have smoke bombs. We will have stink bombs.
Wow.
We regard Dr. Sax as a transphobe and a bigot, and we will not allow him to speak in Easton, Connecticut. And the superintendent said, he's not talking about gender. He's talking about TikTok. He's not even going to mention transgender. And they said, we don't care. He's a bigot, and we will not allow him to set foot in Easton, Connecticut. And so I was canceled.
Wow, yep. Dr. Sax. The threats and the fear of the truth, I guess, really lights people up. And so you continue to speak at private schools, and you're very welcome at Christian schools and Catholic schools and Jewish schools across the nation. And we're so glad, because one of the things that we value about you and your speaking is all the years of research that you have done and the studying you've done to support the facts here. So let's dive into this chapter that you added and included in your book, The Collapse of Parenting, that is titled Babies.
So when the first edition of The Collapse of Parenting came out, it's now more than 8 years ago. I'm glad to say it was a New York Times bestseller. And the publisher reached out and said, it's time for a new edition, which I agree, because a lot of things have changed. The first edition made no mention of transgender because it really wasn't a thing when I was writing the previous edition. I mean, that was just in 2015. It's not that long ago, but this is really new. It's all happened in a very short period of time. No mention of transgender in the first edition, but I felt we need to discuss this in the second edition, even though I wrote a whole other book called Why Gender Matters, which has a whole lot actually, the first edition of Why Gender Matters doesn't have anything on transgender, because when I wrote the first edition 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing. 30 years ago, exactly 30 years ago, in 1994, the American Psychiatric Association raised the question, how common is transgender? And they said, it's so rare that we cannot estimate with any accuracy. But we estimate it as roughly 1 in 30,000 men, and perhaps 1 in 100,000 women. So we just this month got the latest numbers, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, a national survey, a very carefully executed survey conducted by the Centers for Disease Control of high school students in the United States, showing that just over 3% of high school students now say they are transgender, and an additional 2% say that they are non-binary, neither male nor female. So we've gone from fewer than 1 in 10,000 adults saying they are transgender to more than 3 in 100 high school students saying they are transgender in less than 30 years. So in my book, Why Gender Matters, second edition, I go into a deep dive into why that is so. This first edition, as I said, doesn't address this because 20 years ago it wasn't a thing. But the second edition has 12 chapters, the last 4 of which are gender nonconforming, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex, with a pretty deep dive into what happened in a short period of time that so many kids are now confused and drifting. And the short answer, the short summary, is that kids are not born knowing what it means to being a man or woman. They have to be taught. And if we don't teach them and we set them adrift in a confused culture, they will be confused. That's the short version. So The Collapse of Parenting is not a book about gender. I wrote a book about gender. The Collapse of Parenting is not that book. But I felt I needed to include a chapter about this because The Collapse of Parenting is a book about parental authority. And what has happened that I thought is relevant is that in blue states and in purple states like Colorado, there has been a concerted effort to undermine parental authority. And I share a number of stories in that new chapter in The Collapse of Parenting where confused kids have transitioned or have actively been teachers at their schools have tried to persuade children as young as 6, according to court documents. I describe how a teacher in Pennsylvania tried to persuade a 6-year-old to transition, a 6-year-old boy to transition to being a girl without the parents' knowledge or consent. And the parents, when they learned of this, sued the district. And this case is in court right now. And the school district's response was that the parents had no right to contest what the teacher was doing in the school. And that's why I thought it was relevant to include in a book about parental authority that there are now school districts in Pennsylvania, which is not a blue state, it's a purple state. And it's my home state, and this district is not far from my home, where a school district will, in court, say that a parent has no right to any knowledge of what a teacher is doing in the first grade classroom, that a teacher has full right to tell this 6-year-old that, you know what, your parents think you're a boy, but I think you're a girl, and I think you should transition to being a girl, and that there's nothing wrong with the teacher doing that, and that the school district has the nerve to say that in a court of law against the parents' will. I think parents need to be on their guard. I think parents need to be aware that public school districts now are willing to say such a thing, that you need to be on your guard, that school districts are willing to do this. Your kid is perfectly fine, perfectly normal, goes into school, and this teacher, who happens to have a transgender kid, now has their own agenda and is setting out now to try to persuade your kid that your son should be a girl. That's really harmful. And you need to be on your guard. You need to be aware, because your kid has no problems, but going to a school with a teacher with an agenda could create problems for your kid.
Wow. I know when I was reading that chapter and I saw the blurb about, the flyer that the parent put up inside the school that says...
That the teacher put up inside the school.
Oh, yes, you're right. Yes.
The teacher put up a flyer in the school, said that if your parent doesn't approve of your transitioning, then I'm your mom now. And this was a different lawsuit, a different case. But again, parents across the United States are waking up to this concern that many of these teachers who have this agenda encouraging their kids in elementary school and middle school to transition to the other sex without the parents' knowledge or consent. And again, a number of the stories I share, the parents themselves are left of center in California and Massachusetts and New Jersey, and they said, I feel stabbed in the back. Here my daughter has ADHD, she's on the spectrum, and she's transitioning to the male role, and the school didn't even notify me. She's been identifying as a boy at school for 6 months, and the school didn't tell me. I'm left of center. I'm a card-carrying Democrat, and the school regards me as the enemy. Why? I don't get this. I'm a member of the ACLU. Why am I regarded as the enemy? And I thought these were plaintive voices. These are left of center ACLU member Democratic parents who are like, why is this school regarding me as the enemy? Because I'm the parent. So I think it's important for parents to understand that, unfortunately, many public schools now have a default of regarding parents as the enemy. That's a problem. And I thought that's why, even though The Collapse of Parenting is not a book about gender, I think we needed a chapter about this transgender issue in this book, that parents need to be on their guard, need to be aware.
Well, and that gives me hope and motivates me as a parent of young children. I have an 18-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 10-year-old, and we are the authority of our children. And I think so many times the culture can give us this message that, you should just let your child choose. And, they know what's best for them. They've been living in this body forever. And you even say in your book the idea that kids are brought up to, just kind of question their identity and wait until they're 5, 6, or 7 to determine themselves whether they're male or female, or non-binary, like you said.
So I just had the privilege this past Sunday of preaching a sermon. This was a first for me. I have never before in my life stood in the pulpit to preach a Sunday morning sermon. I'm not ordained. I've never been to seminary, but Pastor Kevin at Church of the Savior in Wayne, Pennsylvania, happens to be a fan, has read all 4 of my books, and invited me to preach the sermon. And of course, he and I met, and he said, if you preach the sermon, what would you preach? And I said, I would preach on biblical parenting. And it would be based on Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7, which is usually translated, teach them diligently to your children. But I am a student of biblical Hebrew, and I can tell you that's not what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew is Vishinantam Levanecha, and I have an exegesis of this passage in the Collapse of Parenting. It would be easy to say that in biblical Hebrew. The verb there would be lamed, to teach, but the verb is not lamed. The verb is shanein. Shanein doesn't mean to teach. It means to chisel in stone. It comes from the Hebrew root shane, meaning tooth. So a better translation of Vishinantam Levanecha, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7, would be something like, incise these laws in the hearts of your children, inscribe or chisel these laws in the hearts of your children. And right alongside that, I cite a column from the New York Times. A longtime columnist for the New York Times, Jennifer Finney Boylan, wrote a column on enlightened parenting, in which she asserts that enlightened parenting means setting your child free to discover for themselves their own right and wrong. And if in so doing your child becomes a stranger to you, then so be it. So that was my sermon this past Sunday. Putting those two side by side. Biblical parenting is Vishinantam Levanecha. Incise these laws in the hearts of your children. Biblical parenting is both strict and loving. You set that alongside contemporary parenting that you get from the New York Times and National Public Radio. Good parenting means letting your kids decide. Let your kid discover for themselves their own right and wrong. Well, it turns out that we have good evidence. We have the work of Diana Baumrind and other leading parenting researchers that show us that the best parenting is authoritative parenting. It's strict and loving. Incise your laws in the hearts of your children. It turns out that biblical parenting is evidence-based parenting. It turns out the New York Times, National Public Radio, set your kid loose to discover for themselves their own right and wrong, is permissive parenting. And the result is kids who are anxious and depressed and addicted to drugs and alcohol. We know this. And again, a great deal of my book, The Collapse of Parenting, well, 2 chapters to be precise, is devoted to the longitudinal cohort studies, showing that parenting that is strict and loving results in kids who are happy and healthy and doing well. Whereas the New York Times National Public Radio parenting, permissive parenting, results in kids who are anxious and depressed and much more likely to be addicted to drugs and alcohol. It turns out that biblical parenting is evidence-based parenting and results in kids who are happy and healthy and doing well. That was my sermon, and
Wow.
Pastor Kevin was pleased, and we had a good result from the congregation.
Wonderful. I love your references back to the Bible. I remember, early on when I interviewed you and we were talking about social media and phones, and you referenced the Our Father, and you said, Jordan, it says right there, lead us not into temptation. Yes. As parents, we cannot tempt our children into things that are going to be terrible for them. We have to be we have to be the one that takes the brunt of it for the child, where we give our kids permission to say, my parents are rotten. They don't let me be on my phone after 8 o'clock, right? It makes sense to me why you had been asked to give a sermon. So what else do we need to know that's going on out in our culture regarding, this gender confusion with kids, and kind of what we can do as parents to help our kids understand the truth about their gender?
Well, I think the most important new finding in the research has to do with social media. my brand, if you like, is evidence-based parenting, and all throughout my 4 books, I'm always telling parents, any recommendation I'm going to make to you is based in evidence. When I make a recommendation, I'm always going to show you the scholarly research as well as my clinical experience as a family physician with 3 decades of experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what do we know about social media? Well, certainly the leading researcher there, Jean Twenge, did this huge study back in 2019 with her colleague Keith Campbell, following over 200,000 adolescents over time. And on the x-axis is time spent on social media, and on the y-axis is the likelihood of becoming anxious or depressed. And there's no rise in that trend line until 30 minutes a day. And once you get beyond 30 minutes a day, you see a pretty linear rise going up and up and up and up and up. So how much time on social media is too much time? Based on that study, I would say less than 30 minutes a day is fine. But that study was published in 2019, based on data gathered in 2018, which means it's before TikTok. So TikTok changed everything. And studies published since then, now in the TikTok era, there's no safe amount of time. The risk begins at time 0. And I reached out to Jean Twenge last year, and I said, you've seen all these newer studies. There's no safe amount of time. And she responded to my email, and she said, the evidence now supports a total ban on social media for all kids under 18 years of age. And I said, can I quote you? And she said, yes, you may quote me. And so that's what I've been sharing with parents now, a total ban on social media for all kids under 18 years of age. And I think I really, really push that for parents. And so, a lot of people have been buzzing about John Haidt's big book, The Anxious Generation, which is indeed a publishing phenomenon, #1 New York Times bestseller, top on the Amazon bestseller list, top 10 every week since it was published back in March. But there's one big thing that John Haidt has overlooked. So he's really big on pointing out that this rise in anxiety and depression began with Instagram, began around 2010, 11, 12. And it's gotten worse since TikTok. And that's true. But one thing that he overlooks is that it's only in the English-speaking world. It's not true in Greece. It's not true in Russia. Kids in Greece and Russia are just as likely to have smartphones. They're just as likely to be on smartphones as kids in the United States at 10, at 12, at 14 years of age. But they're not any more likely. They're not. The rise in anxiety and depression has not been seen outside the English-speaking world. And I recently wrote an article pointing this out. And the new edition of The Collapse of Parenting, because we had this data in time for the new edition. It's a major focus of the new edition. Why? What's going on in the English-speaking world? So I think this is a major problem with John Haidt's book. He believes that the big problem is in the device. He thinks you need to take away the smartphone. And I think he's overlooking the culture. John Haidt, with all due respect, brilliant guy, great book. He's an atheist who lives in Manhattan, and he loves Manhattan. And he's overlooking the toxic American culture. He loves American culture. He loves Manhattan, and he's an atheist. He can't see it. He doesn't regard it as a problem. He lives in it. He swims in it. He doesn't see it as a problem. I'm not an atheist, and I don't live in Manhattan. I see the atheist culture of Manhattan as a problem, and he is overlooking it. So, and if you don't want to read my book, The Collapse of Parenting, that's fine. Just Google my name and Institute for Family Studies, and maybe Jordan, you could include a link to the article I just wrote 2 weeks ago for Institute for Family Studies, titled Toxic Culture or Toxic Phones. Maybe it's Toxic Phones or Toxic Culture. The editor gave the title, where I begin by mentioning John Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. Then I link to the research showing that this rise in anxiety and depression is not seen outside the English-speaking world. and I make one of the central claims in the new edition, which is that the rise in anxiety and depression and transgender, which have all occurred in the last 15 years and are all confined to the English-speaking world. You don't see this rise in transgender in Greece and Russia.
This
You
is
see it
true.
in the English-speaking world. It is due to this peculiar confusion in the English-speaking world. What's going on in the English-speaking world? It's the culture of disrespect. It's the collapse of parenting. And a third ingredient that we haven't talked about yet, and it's very relevant to this transgender issue, normophobia. Normophobia. N-O-R-M-O phobia. Normophobia. A term coined earlier this year by Mary Harrington, just in time for me to include it in the Collapse of Parenting before the book went to press. Mary Harrington, writing in a magazine called First Things, talked about how young people today, teens and young adults, have this new fear. And as soon as I read her article, I said, that's the word I've been looking for that describes what I'm seeing in my interviews with young people and in the office as a family doctor. So 15 years ago, I wrote a book called Girls on the Edge, sharing what I was observing in the office with girls back then, talking about the late 2000s. Back then, girls in the late 2000s wanted to be effortlessly perfect. That was the thing back then. And the book was well received. The Atlantic magazine, Caitlin Flanagan, called it the best book about girls and young women in the United States today. Very proud of that. Then the publisher asked me to write a new edition, published more recently, and I found that things had really changed. Girls today don't want to be effortlessly perfect. That's boring. They don't want to be perfect at all. You got to be, that's boring. That's boring. Boring. The social media is teaching kids, are you neurotypical or are you neurodivergent?
Mm-hmm.
Are you gender typical or are you gender conforming or are you gender non-conforming? Well, who wants to be typical and conforming? Typical and conforming are boring,
Right.
lame, unimaginative. You want to be non-conforming. You want to be divergent. The terms kids learn in the social media of the English-speaking world. And Matthew Crawford had a great article on this, which I also cite on his Substack. He says it incentivizes kids to be pathological. Social media in American popular culture now incentivizes kids to think of themselves as nothing worse than being white and straight. That is like really bad. White, straight, and Christian is like the worst thing you can be. You've got to be something else. So being queer is good. Being bi is good. Being trans is excellent. So 50 years ago, C.S. Lewis, no, it's not 50 years ago, it's 70 years ago, C.S. Lewis wrote a book for children called The Magician's Nephew. And in his book, he said, the problem about trying to make yourself stupider than you really are is that you very often succeed. You very often succeed. And in my essay, I say, substitute more anxious or more depressed for stupider, and you begin to understand what's happening right now. The problem with trying to make yourself more anxious or more depressed than you really are is that you very often succeed. Being normal is now lame and boring and unimaginative. The collapse of parenting has set kids adrift in a newly toxic culture of disrespect and envy, in which it's cool to be depressed and queer and trans and anxious, and to present yourself as anxious and depressed and trans. But this is only true in the English-speaking world. We don't find this outside the English-speaking world. So I also talk to parents about some medical terms, vectors and causal agents. So let's talk about malaria. The Anopheles mosquito is the vector of malaria, but it's not the causal agent of malaria. The causal agent is a microorganism called Plasmodium falciparum. You have to use a microscope to see this little tiny microorganism. That's what actually causes malaria. The mosquito spreads Plasmodium falciparum, the microorganism that causes malaria. You won't get malaria unless the mosquito bites you. So yeah, you need to block the mosquito with mosquito netting, etc. But you don't need to worry about malaria if you live in Colorado, because you don't have the mosquitoes there. You don't have the causal agent there. Without the causal agent, you won't get the malaria. They have phones in Greece and Russia, but those kids are not transgender. Those kids are not anxious and depressed because they don't have the causal agent. The causal agent is the toxic American culture. We need to lock down the phones and the social media in North America, not because the phones themselves are evil, contrary to John Haidt, but because the culture has become evil. And this is where John Haidt, I think, has missed something really important. The culture, this toxic culture of transgender and normophobia, has become really harmful. And we do have to limit the phones and lock down the social media, because the phones are transmitting this toxic culture. The phones are like that mosquito transmitting that toxic culture. But the phones themselves are not the toxicity. The toxicity is in the social media and the toxic culture of normophobia and transgenderism.
So that is so interesting to me. And I would agree with you. I was just in Greece on vacation last year, and I really did not see the same types of things with children over there. Matter of fact, at all. I didn't see this confusion in the way they dressed or identified or anything. I didn't see any evidence of that. But I'm a little bit naive about social media. I guess I figured people in Greece and Russia and other countries are watching TikTok of American kids.
Well,
are they
and
just
also they're
consuming
not. But I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not holding up Russia as a role model. I have great concerns about Russian culture, but I'm merely using it as a reference point. Russian kids are not in a hurry to be transgender. That's the only point I'm making here. Mm-hmm. American girls are in a hurry to be transgender. We're seeing an explosion of American teenage girls. Again, this is not a guess. More than 3% of American high school kids now identify as transgender. 20 years ago, it was undetectable. Now it's more than 3%. That's a huge change in 20 years. And that's not happening in Russia. It's not happening in Greece. Even though Russian kids and Greek kids have phones, they don't have American culture. It's American culture that's driving this. It's American confusion about gender that is driving this. Greek culture and Russian culture is not confused about gender, but American culture is. If we don't teach girls to be women and boys to be men, then they're confused and bad things happen. And again, that's the focus of my book, Why Gender Matters. We do need to teach boys to be men. We need to teach girls to be women. What does that mean? That's a different topic. But you can't just cut kids loose and set them adrift in American culture when that culture is a toxic culture.
Yes. That reminds me of a bit of an interview I remember hearing that you did, or maybe it was an article you wrote about your own childhood and your preferences as a young boy. And how would that be interpreted today? Tell us a little bit about yourself growing up. And
so in Why Gender Matters, Chapter 9 is on gender nonconforming. So I was and am a gender nonconforming a boy. I like ballet. I did macrame as a boy. And that's fine. I turned out to be a straight man. But today, a boy who liked ballet and macrame might very well be asked, what are your preferred pronouns? Do you want to transition to the female role? Which is really harmful and really toxic and really scary if you think about it. And I recall asking my mom when I was 7 or 8 years old, if I marry a woman, will I have to take my clothes off in bed with her? And she said, yes, you will, but you will want to. And I said, no, I won't. Girls have cooties. You can't ask a prepubescent child about their sexual orientation because prepubescent children don't have a sexual orientation. It's not developmentally appropriate. So there's so much confusion right now in the guidelines of the American Academy of Pediatrics, which literally are incoherent because they are written based in the assumption that a 6-year-old child knows their sexual orientation. The American Academy of Pediatrics says that a 6-year-old boy says he's a girl, you should transition him to the female role. You should change his name to Emily. Those are the guidelines. And I have debated this point actually with pediatricians who don't know the guidelines. They assume that can't be true. They haven't read the guidelines. And they said, no. The guidelines say you wait. I said, no, they don't. They don't say that. They condemn watchful waiting as transphobic. You need to go back and read the guidelines. And I was doing this at a grand rounds at a residency program, and they actually had to pull up the guidelines and read them aloud to this pediatrician who had not read the guidelines, assumed that they couldn't say such a ridiculous thing. And this board certified pediatrician had no idea what the guidelines actually said, and just had to sit in stunned silence, not aware that the American Academy of Pediatrics had actually was commanding him to go against his own experience and training and instead listen to a 6-year-old. If a 6-year-old boy says he's a girl, you, the pediatrician, are supposed to facilitate that transition and change his name to Emily, change the birth certificate to Emily. Justin never existed. Those are the official guidelines of the American Academy of Pediatrics, published in 2018 and reaffirmed by the Academy in 2023.
And is it true that the American Academy of Pediatrics also indicates that you should change the gender on the birth certificate,
yes,
as if that boy never
yes,
even existed?
Yes, as I just said, you're supposed to change the birth certificate to the 6-year-old's preference. If Justin says he's a girl, you're supposed to change the birth certificate to female and start that boy on the road that will lead to castration and cross-sex hormones. And again, this is not based in evidence. It is contrary to evidence. We have a great deal of research, which I cite in the second edition of my book, Why Gender Matters. We know a lot about these boys. University of Toronto, especially, the team there has Ken Zucker and his people have followed these boys. We know that you followed this boy 15 years down the road at 20 years of age. The great majority of these boys do not say that they're female. They don't want to be women. Some of them are gay men. They're very happy as gay men. They don't want to have their testicles cut off. They're perfectly fine without medication. As Dr. Zucker has said, you need to just wait. You don't know what's going to happen down the road, but the great majority of these boys will not persist in saying that they're female. They won't. So to change his name to Emily and put him in a dress is not in his best interest. That's what the evidence shows. The American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines are not based in evidence. They contradict the evidence. And in support of their guidelines, they cited one study, a 1994 study, showing that efforts to convert adult male homosexuals to straight men were unsuccessful. That's utterly irrelevant. So here are pediatricians confusing adult male sexual orientation with the sexual identity of children. So they're confusing sexual identity with sexual orientation, and they're confusing adults with children.
Mm.
That's a pretty major error for pediatricians to make, which I pointed out in my letter to the editor, which they published alongside the guidelines, which is just weird. I've been reading the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines literally for 40 years. Since I was a medical student at the University of Pennsylvania 40 years ago. Usually when they publish a hostile letter alongside the guidelines, when they publish their official guidelines and then they publish a hostile letter saying these guidelines are totally ridiculous, look, the evidence doesn't support the guidelines. A few weeks later, the authors will publish a rebuttal saying, well, Dr. So-and-so is mistaken because they never published a rebuttal, and my letter is still there. You can go to the original guidelines, Rafferty et al., 2018, and scroll down to the bottom and see my letter. They never published a rebuttal. It's just weird.
But also, they've never changed the guidelines.
And they have never changed the guidelines. On the contrary, they have reaffirmed the guidelines because the guidelines are not based in evidence. The guidelines of the American Academy are based in politics. And the politics have not changed. And as long as the guidelines are based in politics and the politics have not changed, the politics are based in very leftist center politics, which is that gender is a social construct, that the notions of male and female are merely inventions of the heteronormative patriarchy, according to Judith Butler, professor of comparative literature at University of California, Berkeley. And anyone who says otherwise is a Republican or a Christian or some other patriarch, and we don't need to pay any attention to them. That's the politics that supports these guidelines, which, as I said, contradict the evidence.
So if you're a parent listening, this is Dr. Leonard Sax talking about why gender matters and just the confusion around gender identity among some kids and specifically in public schools. So Dr. Sax, as a parent of young elementary aged kids, what would you recommend? How do you recommend parents speak to their children when their children bring home issues like Johnny is now wearing a skirt to school and asking us to call him Sally? How would you handle that as a parent these days?
I had the privilege a few weeks ago speaking at Mount Calvary Lutheran Church in Acton, Massachusetts. Did 6 presentations over 2 days. And parents there told me that at the local elementary school, in 2nd grade, there are a cohort of girls who, with the encouragement of the teacher, have been deconstructing gender. And for a while, these girls were going by he, but more recently, these girls have insisted on being referred to as it. And so you're now supposed to say, what do you think of what it just said? And a mom told me how her daughter has been coming home very confused. And mom asked me, what should I say to the teacher? And my advice is blunt. You need to leave the school. You're not going to change that school. This is Massachusetts. It's a blue state. The odds that you are going to persuade that school that they are wrong, that Judith Butler is wrong, is very small, because what they are teaching is perfectly in line with the Harvard Graduate School of Education, with University of Wisconsin-Madison, with University of Texas Austin. This is absolutely in line with what most of the quote-unquote leading schools of education in the United States now teach, which is that gender is a social construct, which is that male and female are inventions of the heteronormative patriarchy, which is that we should encourage kids to deconstruct their gender beginning at 5 years of age. You're not going to change that. You need to leave the school. Unfortunately, you need to leave the school. And if you can't find a local school that you can afford, then you may need to move. And I'm not telling you to do anything that we didn't do. My wife and I thought we were infertile. We were not able to have kids. We got evaluated. We were told we were infertile. And then after 15 years of marriage, we conceived a child, the old-fashioned way. Mm-hmm. And we were not happy with the local schools, and so we moved to Chester County, Pennsylvania. So I'm not asking you to do anything we didn't do. If you're not happy with your local schools, you have to move. And incidentally, I'd like to put in a plug for Utah. If you're going to move, Utah is the most family-friendly of all the states, and I have visited almost all of them. You don't have to be Mormon. I am not. But I have been very impressed on my visits to Utah, in Salt Lake and Sandy and Provo. It is a very family-friendly place. I'm sure maybe you can tell me good things about other communities, but I have been really impressed with how the public schools in Utah really make an effort to be family-friendly and endorse traditional families. Utah is a really family-friendly place, and I actually have spoken to. There's a governor's council in Utah that has that I've worked with recently, and they're taking this seriously. So I just want to say a shout out for Utah.
Yes, awesome. Well, and I know there's some great schools in Colorado that you have visited and spoken at as well that have very Christian values and are, like you said, family oriented and supporting
Yeah,
this.
but and if you are looking for looking for those parents who cannot afford a private school. I mean, there's a ton of great private schools, but you got to have money. If you cannot afford a private school, I also want to make a shout out for the Hillsdale Public Charter Schools, which are wonderful, and I've spoken at more than half of them nationwide. Now, the problem with a public charter school, though, is that it's a lottery, and there's no guarantee that you're going to get in. But that's a great network of public charter schools. But it's a real problem if you're talking about a regular public school in the United States. You need to be sure that that school is going to be teaching things that are in line with your values. So you may have to move. Your kid has to be your first priority.
Yes, I think that brings us back to the point that we, the parents, are the authority of our children, and we know their best interests, and we do have to rise above the status quo of this culture, this crazy American culture, and have the courage to make decisions about what's best for our kids that go against mainstream culture right now. And that's what we're about here at Families of Character, is giving parents the courage and confidence they need to say no when the rest of culture is saying yes to things that really go against our morals and values. And I remember being told when I was a young parent, Jordan, as a young mother, you are responsible to be the primary educator of your kids in faith and morals. And I thought, yeah, I knew that. I really didn't. I said, what does that actually mean? And one of the things my husband and I found that we were doing totally without realizing it was outsourcing the development of our kids' morals and faith to these great, Christian schools they were going to. We thought that they were getting everything they needed there. And then when they were home with us after a long day at work, we would, feed them and bathe them and get them ready for school the next day and kind of rinse and repeat. And it wasn't really until we left the school system during COVID and started homeschooling that it made sense for us. Oh, it's not just teaching your kids math. That's not what it means to be the primary educator of your kid in faith and morals, but it means bringing your faith into the home, living out your values, with your children so that they recognize the good and the true and the beautiful right in their own home. That way, when they're out in the crazy culture, because they will be, we've traveled to 49 out of the 50 states, and every state we've been to has a very confused culture of young kids. They witness this. They come back home and they're going like, those people are confused. That was kind of strange, but they don't feel like they need to join the crowd, right? Mm-hmm. So I think, making sure that at home we are providing just a great role model for them to see the true differences between men and women and the goodness that comes from these beautiful marriages and families that helps with kind of ward off this confusion with your own children. So one of the things I kind of was thinking about was also just when you were talking about, changing schools, like you might have to do something drastic and get your kid out of the school. Do you have a list on your website of all the schools that you have spoken at, or the schools that you are speaking to?
Sure. So if you go to my website, leonardsax.com, leonardsax.com, click on workshops, then click on schedule, and you can see all of my upcoming visits, although I need to update that and put in some of the upcoming visits. And then you can also look back and see all the visits I've done all the way back to 2005. And again, if you go back to 2005, you'll see it was all public schools back then. And in the last few years, it's all private schools, Catholic schools, and Protestant schools. So you can get a sense of the variety of schools I visited at and how it's changed over time, for sure.
That's wonderful. I've had many of parents reach out to me since we had you on other episodes of our show and say, like, how do we get Dr. Sax to speak at our kids' school? So I always direct them back to your website and to contact you directly through there, send an email to request that you come speak. But I think a couple of us are just going to get together and find like a particular, weekend and say, we got 4 schools for you right in the same neighborhood. Will you come, Dr. Sax? Because this is just so helpful. This is what we want to hear, is the research and the evidence behind why gender matters and what's truly good for our kids and how to make decisions, even though they may be contrary to what everyone else is doing, to really protect the souls of our young children. So Dr. Sax, can you mention the 4 books that you have out there right now? And I believe you're working on another one. Maybe you wrapped it up already, but.
So Why Gender Matters. Again, you want to be sure to get the updated 2nd edition. Boys Adrift. Also be sure to get the updated 2nd edition. Girls on the Edge. Get the updated 2nd edition. And The Collapse of Parenting. You want to get the updated 2nd edition, which just came out October 1, which is hard to find on Amazon. When you go to Amazon.com and you type in, thank you, The Collapse of Parenting, you've got the right one. Amazon wants to sell you the old edition. If you have any trouble finding it, go to my website, leonardsax.com, click on books, click on The Collapse of Parenting, and then you'll get the link to get the new edition. And I also want to make a plug for the audiobook. For the first time ever, the publisher allowed me to read the audiobook.
Awesome.
So, and you can, wherever you get your audiobooks, you can click on the free excerpt, which begins with a story from the office where mom brought in her daughter, 6-year-old daughter, who was sick with a fever and sore throat. And I asked the daughter to open her mouth and say, ah. And the daughter said, no. And I said, Mom, looks like I'm going to need your help here. Would you please ask your daughter to open her mouth and say, ah? And Mom said, her body, her choice. So you can listen to me read that book wherever you get your audiobooks. So that was great fun. 10 hours of audiobook. And the producer was... It was 20 hours of recording. It was grueling over many sessions, but it's done.
Well, we love your voice, and the face-to-face is always preferred, but if we could get you in our ear for a long road trip across the United States or a good flight to Europe or something and binge the book on audio, we will do it. So, Dr. Sax, thank you for being with us. Thank you for being courageous and willing to go up against your colleagues and authors that are getting a lot of publicity to share the truth and to go deeper than just what the eye can see. That's what I appreciate about you, is that you're willing to dig down and get at it at the root level versus just kind of plucking the head off the dandelion to make things look good or be acceptable to society. So if you'll come and join us again, we'll have you back. There's all kinds of things we can talk about with you, but appreciate you coming back on the Families of Character show. And guys, if you want anything of Dr. Sax's books, the link to the research article, you can find that in our show notes. So just scroll down here in this episode and you will find links to purchase his books and to read his research articles.
Thanks again for inviting me. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And guys, we'll catch you on another episode of our show real soon. Please be sure to share this episode with those in your community.